Burning Man is one of those things that can change your life. The first time I went, it was a life changer. And I would say that I would not have embarked on that round the world journey without Burning Man. Without suggesting that people literally go to Burning Man, I think doing something like that can be a life changer. It can just make you completely rethink why you're here, what you're doing, and what to do with the rest of your life.
That was Tony Fletcher, today's guest, talking about one of his life-changing trips. Tony is a British-born author of best-selling biographies of Keith Moon, Wilson Pickett, R.E.M., and the Smiths. He has written a memoir, a novel, and many other books about music. And back in 2016, he backpacked around the world with his then-wife and 11-year-old younger son, which is another life-changing trip he talks about in this interview, and how coming out of that, he had a big realization. He's going to share a bit about that. And I love Tony's punk rock attitude, I guess, his unconventional approach to life. Even as a teenager, he went ahead and started a fanzine, started interviewing all of these artists he admired. And this is during the rise of punk rock in the late 70s. He shares in his interview today what it was like interacting with artists at such a young age, and how that really put him out of his comfort zone and what that did for him. And getting out of your comfort zone is another topic we cover. Tony actually has a podcast called One Step Beyond, which documents people who take a step outside of their comfort zone to enrich their life. And he shares some of the best lessons from those experiences there. He's a great interviewer. I had to ask him about interviewing because he has conducted so many interviews over the years. And really what this comes down to is not just interviewing, but I thought this was valuable advice for us as travelers, because we want to connect. We want to connect with other travelers. We want to connect with locals. And how do you really connect on a deep level in a way that opens up a place, opens up the experience for yourself and for the other person, and opens up a country and a culture? And I think it's possible to have some intentionality behind that and to learn from some of the best out there. And since Tony has done we figured over 1,000 interviews over his lifetime, thought it was a good opportunity to get some advice with him for you around creating those connections out in the world. Also, Tony talks about some of the lessons around his backpacking trip around the world. We get into some of the economics of that, how they were able to afford it. He provides some advice and shares his number one tip for getting the most out of your next travel experience. And being a big music fan, I had to ask him about some of his experiences working in music. He has interviewed the Paul McCartney, so I wanted to learn how that all went down. He did that as a teenager, which is insane. He's worked with the Pixies, which is another iconic band. And overall, he's just lived a pretty incredible life, carving out a career around his passion for writing, his passion for music. And anytime I talk to somebody who's found a way to carve their own path, I always feel there's so much to learn, and I'm excited to share that with you today. So I hope you enjoy the interview. But first, we got to get into the show, don't we? We're still at the top here. Thanks for listening, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey there, it's Jason with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show, my friend. Thanks for hanging out, letting me bring a little travel into your ears. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. I hope this show finds you well, my friend. Thank you so much for being a part of this community. And get in touch if you haven't done so. I leave a link to my voicemail box in all of these show notes. You can just leave a message and say hi. Love to hear from listeners of the show. Let me know what's up with you. Got so many fun episodes coming up, so if you haven't followed or subscribed to the podcast, go ahead and do that. If you're new, welcome. If you've been around for a while, welcome back. Let's get into the conversation with Tony Fletcher. By the way, you can learn more about Tony at tonyfletcher.net. We'll link up to all of it in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed the interview. Stick around on the back end. I'm going to talk about the joy in the potential. you'll hear what that's all about. Plus, I'll leave you with a nice quote to send you off on your day. Please enjoy my chat with Tony. I'll see you on the other side, my friend.
This is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train. Thank you for riding with MTA New York City Transit.
What does that shirt say, by the way?
It says only elephants should wear ivory. I think only elephants should wear ivory. Yes,
Nice.
it's from Tanzania.
Yeah. When did you go there?
I've been there twice. One of the only places I've been twice. I was there in 2016 on our world travels, but I didn't get to, because I had the kid with me, and did not get to climb even Mount Meru, which we were at the base of. So I went back in 2019, put a group together, and climbed Kilimanjaro.
How was that experience?
It's literally and metaphorically one of the highlights of my life. So by far and away the highest I've ever been on the planet, and that actually also works metaphorically and literally, because the altitude really gets to you, and you are high in a way that there's no real comparison to it. And it's that part of it is very strange, and I think we spent a little too long at the summit. But what an incredible experience! It's one of those. Kilimanjaro has so many great things to it, but as well as being the tallest mountain in Africa and the biggest standalone mountain in the world, it's also the highest mountain in the world that you can climb without being a climber. So you can just hike to the top. It's really, really tough work, but you take several days. You bond with so many people, and I love Tanzania. And fortunately, we went with there's somebody who lives in my area who was born there, became a porter, then a guide. And an American ended up really taking a liking to him and helping sponsor him to come over here for his education. And so he stayed here and raised a family here, and carries on taking groups up the mountain when he can. So we kind of had that kind of best of both worlds. He put together a really good crew for us. It was wonderful.
That's cool. You're from England, but you're in the States, right? You're based in the States.
Yeah, I moved over in my 20s to New York City, and when you do something like that really young, there's no great plan. There's no great in 35 years I will still be here and my kids will be grown and I'll be, living in this place in Kingston, New York. You don't know. You roll with the moment, and I've got to say, you sort of turn around 10 years later and you're like, oh, I'm married to an American, I'm living in New York, and I guess this is my life for the time being.
Yeah. That's how you ended up there, I guess, sticking around, huh?
Yeah,
by
you
way
stick
of
around.
Marriage.
By right of marriage. And I mean, listen, that's not uncommon. I've got other British friends here that similar things happen. I don't think any of us said we are going to be in New York State forever, let alone the Hudson Valley. I'm not sure any of us moved specifically to the Hudson Valley. Most of us would have come through New York City first. But it's not an uncommon thing. I think maybe all of us would have been attracted by New York and also fed up with the UK at that time, and I definitely subscribe to that. And New York City is just, I've been to a lot of cities in the world, and New York City, even in its more gentrified state from when I first moved there, it still is just one of the greatest places on earth. It really is. Yeah.
Well, having smaller travel experiences growing up, taking, small trips with my parents in the car, wherever around here and there, nothing big, right? But the trip to New York City, which was just an hour plus train ride from where I grew up at 9 or 10 years old, and being able to remember that and the impressions of New York City I felt like that was like my first travel adventure, even though it was just, an hour and a half up the rail there from my suburban Philadelphia area. Because it was so many impressions all at once, everywhere, all the time.
New York City is one of those rare places that actually lives up to the movies.
Right.
You get there. The first time I went there was on a day trip from Boston. And I mean, I just instantly fell in love with the place. And it's like the steam rising up from the roads, from the subway, through the grates, and you can smell it. And you're just like, I thought this was only in the movies. I didn't realize this is all for real. The 24-hour nature of it. It has changed. I think every big city has changed, and in many, many ways for the better. I was at an age where the sort of danger of it I mean, I moved there in the late 80s, and by 1990, I think crime was peaking, the AIDS deaths were peaking, the crack epidemic was peaking, and those three things were related. And I would go back to the UK, and my friends would be, "How comes you're not getting shot there?" And it wasn't like I didn't see guns or didn't hear the occasional gunfire, but you're pretty foolhardy when you're in your early 20s, and I was. The city just seemed open for me. It was a point at which you could still rent inexpensively, and I think it was going through one of its booms and busts, and it was in a bust because of the things I mentioned, and that allowed for a lot of possibilities on the sort of underground level. And I just felt New York City welcomed me with open arms. I don't believe in I'm not religious in any sense, but I think that we're all different people, and certain places are meant for us, and just like certain people are meant for us. And I think I was meant to be in New York City during that time of my life.
Well, you have the quote he did a whole book on this. We're going to talk about some of the books, and we have a lot to chat about today, I think. But all hopped up, it was a whole entire book on the music of New York City. So, I mean, when you're saying you love New York City, year spanning 1927 to 1977 was the book and the music that you were writing about during that time period. But a deep love is when you're going and actually researching and pulling out culture from a time frame of a city. That's like a next level love, I feel.
Yeah, it's a deep love. I realized that for all the many, many, many books on different aspects of musical genres that have arguably, and as in the sense of I would say we can win this argument, have emerged from New York City, almost nobody had tried to connect them, and they tended to see things like disco. I mean, a very obvious example would be people see disco and punk as opposites and anathema to each other, and in fact many of the original punks from CBGBs were also hanging out in the discos, and it's all about underground culture. And you wouldn't think that the mambo fits into this, but the mambo leads into rhythm and blues in a way that you wouldn't imagine until you study it. And so I wanted to write a book that connected these genres and talked a lot about why is it New York City, and a lot of it is to do with the immigrant culture. The sort of social economics as immigrants, start from the bottom and work their way up. And the fact that it's such a tightly compressed city means that so much can happen in such a small area. So yeah, that was probably, honestly and truly, that was the hardest I worked on a book, given its market potential. And it's great that people think it's one of the best books on New York City. People do say that. I love that. But man, that was a lot of work. It felt like I wrote 15 or so books in one book.
Well, in the beginning, in the introduction, you have this quote from Lenny Kaye, who you seem to love this quote. He said, "New York is a city that's not going to tell you no."
And there's a positive and a negative to that. So, I mean, when I arrived in New York City, all doors were open. It wasn't a city that said no to me. And I love that because Great Britain, while UK, whatever you want to call it these days, well, I love the place. My roots are there. I'm actually going back there in 2 weeks for the second time this year. Doors were closed. I mean, people were meant to know their place, even in London. And New York City had none of that. So the doors are open, but it's also not a place that will tell you no if you want to sort of fall into the dark side. And if you're around sort of underground culture, if you're around music and fashion and nightclubs, etc., obviously there's a dark side. And so New York City is also, I think what Lenny was getting at, is it's not a place that will say, no, you should go to bed now. It doesn't say that to you. So people have to be careful. It's probably not a place to move if you have an addictive personality. Certainly wouldn't have been when I went there. So you have to be, I did see people succumb to that and get damaged by that, and not all of them made it out of that either.
When you look back on a time period of a place, well, I don't want to use the term glorified because that's a little extreme, right? But, you talk about CBGBs or this era of New York City, and, it's been written about or talked about. And then the experience of that is now, of course, it's past. So we can only relive it again through other people's experiences and what they've written about it. I always think it's a good thought experiment to kind of try to understand where a place is at a given moment. Like in 20 years, what are people going to be writing about? Am I in a place right now where in 20 years, is there a scene happening that I should know about, that I should be a part of? And 20 years from now, people are going to be like, this scene here was, I felt that when I was a tour manager, because going to Brooklyn in the early 2000s, there was definitely something happening with music and stuff like that. And that was one moment where I felt like, okay, this is a thing that will be written about later, and there's something happening here, and it was, and it has been. But generally, I think it's kind of hard to decipher. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a fascinating kind of question, because with all hopped up and ready to go, what I loved about this, what I really loved, is everybody I interviewed from every historical period thought that their scene was the greatest scene ever. And they sort of were sorry for people who didn't get to experience it. And I managed to find all the way back to people who were at the Harlem Apollo in, believe it or not, the 1930s. All the way back, whether it was Washington Square Park with the Folkies, whether they were at CBGB's, whether they went to the Palladium for the Mambo, the disco club, South Bronx hip hop. Benny King was a great example, talking about the vocal groups challenging and walking like a mile up in Harlem to challenge another group you'd heard about. I was part of the British post-punk scene. And that's how I got going. Very, very active as a very young kid. I started the fanzine at a young age, so I was one of the. Every now and then in a scene, you see, a kid who's too young to be in the venue, hanging out and clearly welcomed, and I was one of those people. And at the time, you don't realize that 2030, now 40 years later, it's going to be lionized and held up as one of the great times. But you're having so much fun, and there's so much going on, that you're not totally surprised. And I think that, now I look back on it, and I've just been writing about this period in depth for a second memoir, in great depth. It's pretty obvious, I think, we must have known that this was special. But if you've got nothing that comes before, so you're just a teenager, so you've got nothing to compare it with. Now, I was living in Brooklyn in the early 2000s, and relatively closely involved with that scene. I mean, even then I felt like an elder, but I think I had enough perspective that I remember talking with my friend Anthony, who was the singer for Radio 4, the band Radio 4, but also ran a record shop on my local avenue. So that was a very scenester kind of thing. Yeah, you'd pop in and he'd have all the news and the gossip. And I would occasionally say, this scene is weird because all the bands are playing in Brooklyn. Like, they're being written about in Britain, and they're on front covers and they're selling records, but I can go see any one of them this week. It actually feels real. And he was like, yeah, I think we're living through something. So I hear you with what you're talking about there. I think that I had enough perspective then to say, yeah, this is kind of a special period. I should probably milk this. I'm feeling a little old for it, but actually not much older than James Murphy, if anybody knows who he is. So I was cool. I was fine. Plus, I was able to say, hey, guys, that sounds just like Wire's second album. Believe me, I bought it at the time. I saw them.
LCD Sound System was part of one of the shows I was TMing at. And I guess I did feel a little better. Like I wasn't the oldest guy in the room there.
Yeah, it helps, doesn't it?
What scene's happening now where? Music, travel, culture? I mean, that's a huge question. We could debate it. We could go around the world and try to decipher what's happening where. But I don't. It's just an interesting question. And I wonder when I'm traveling through a place sometimes it's hard to get yourself really in it unless you're spending a lot of quality time there. Oftentimes it's hard as a traveler. So you do the best that you can to become a part of one, let's say, subculture, one part of a city that takes you in, and just have an experience. And I'm going to dwell on these things, but again, I think it's just an interesting thought experiment to kind of take a meta view and wonder where you're living or where you're at or where you spend time, how people are perceiving that in some years.
Sure. And again, a great question. It's all related to travel. I've ended up in the Hudson Valley, which is a major travel destination. And I was just listening to one of your shows, your female accountant, just talking about some areas up here and how, with the pandemic, where I live right now, Kingston, during the pandemic was twice cited in two completely separate stories. Washington Post was absolutely one of them as the hottest real estate market in the country. And it was full of people moving out of New York City once they realized that the office jobs weren't coming back, but they still needed to be close enough. I wouldn't say it made Kingston into a more happening place than it was pre-pandemic. If anything, I would say the opposite. I'm seeing what I saw happen in that area of Brooklyn, where the low rents have gone and the places that were thriving on just doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that are being replaced by what I call stores selling you things you don't need at prices you can't afford. And I see some of that going on, but I've also got to be honest and say, I mean, I love you have a really wide range of ages of guests on here. I am up on the older side now. I always feel cool being in the room, but I can't pretend to be of the scene. So it's more about kind of observing. And I realize that in terms of when there are things going on that run late at night, and I'm like, I go to bed early these days. I couldn't be part of this scene if I want to be part of this scene. But there's a fascination. I think if you treat those who are participating, with the respect that they merit, I always believe, and writing that book, All Hopped Up and Ready to Go, helped confirm this for me. If you don't understand what the kids are doing, good. It wasn't meant for you. I thoroughly believe that. If you don't like the music they're making, good. It's not being made for you. It's being made for them.
Yeah.
They don't need your approval. I thoroughly believe that.
I love that. That's the anti-crotchety old guy attitude, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We don't, we don't
it's
have
actually
to
punk
understand.
rock to have that attitude.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We don't have to understand it. I don't, there's plenty going on in sort of dance music, hip hop, electronic music in particular, because I think rock is kind of recycling itself, that I don't necessarily get. And that's fine. That's fine. I don't go to the nightclubs anymore. So it's not aimed at me, is it? That's cool.
Right. Well, you mentioned being an observer. I mean, that is one of the big roles of a traveler, right? And of course, a writer. I mean, that is something you have to maybe naturally do, or you have to get good. I don't know if you're a natural observer in that way, personality wise, or like how did you know writing was something you wanted to do?
I guess in hindsight, I was born to it. My mother was an English teacher. My dad was I could call him a professor. He was involved in schools music. He did write a couple of books. And my mother didn't write books, but like I say, she was an English teacher and involved in music. And if you think about it that way, I guess me writing about music seems unbelievably obvious. But, it didn't happen to my brother. So I was the one who got born with that. I always loved writing and reading. I was buying books beyond my recommended reading age. I was the kind of kid who would set out to just, say, oh, I'm going to write a novel. And then I remember getting a blank book and writing a bunch of chapter headings and then on different pages. And I was advised that's probably not how novels work. But actually, it's not a bad idea to say this chapter is 8 pages long. You've already written in the next one. So I think some of it was just meant for me. And then being so fortunate as I was, genuinely fortunate. This is the part where I subscribe to people being part of the scene, that I came of age when, not for punk, but when punk sort of moved down to moved to the next level, the new wave and the clubs, and the fact that me and my school friends could get into some of the gigs, and just being around that, being at school in central London, I started a fanzine. I realized I liked doing the fanzine. And like many people, by the way, I look back on my early writings with excruciating embarrassment. It's for somebody who could write. It was almost below my station. My grammar wasn't great. Sometimes I could feel sentences just being like tossed off. But in those days, you typed straight onto a stencil. So if you had to know what you wanted to type, because that was a stencil, and you didn't get too many shots at it. None of this, I've got an open Word document. I can mess with this for the next 5 years.
Right. Well, let's talk about the fanzine. It's funny because I was downloading Jamming was the fanzine, right? And you have a whole book dedicated to the fanzine where you just basically republished a lot of them, but have commentary and things like that. And the download was taking forever. And I'm like, what is going on here? I have not downloaded a PDF that's taken this long in a while. And then I opened it up and I was like, oh yeah, no, that makes sense, because you were doing this in the late 70s, so everything in the fanzine is typed up or drawn or stamped, and it's all very DIY and beautiful, and just such a nice punk, just kind of aesthetic from that era. That's an unavoidable aesthetic, right? Because it's just really out of practicality. It's not like you're opening up a Adobe Photoshop file and being like, I want this to look like. No, this is the authentic thing that people try to replicate later on as designers. But you were doing this when you were like 13 years old or something. Is that correct?
I started it when I was 13. The first 2 issues would have come out when I was 13. They're not very good, and I go back to this a lot. I was somewhat precocious. You know, I wrestled with that a little bit. I wouldn't have minded being just honestly and truly in some ways a bit more normal like that. There were too many good things expected of me, and I sort of rebelled and went the other way.
What do you mean by that? You mean by your parents wanting you to?
I think my parents would like me to have followed probably a more conventional path, but I think teachers and so on sort of had me marked. They wanted me to go off at the age of 11 to, you know, I was told I could get scholarships to these very posh. In Britain, they're called public schools, which is just so ironic because you have to pay for them. But I was encouraged to, you know, to go to these kind of schools. And I already, even at the age of 11, then this is before punk, I was already into my rock music. And I was just, no, I don't want to be with those people. I don't want to be with the sons of daughters. It would have been just sons, I guess, of rich people and diplomats. And I don't want to be in that world. So I didn't. And I went to a grammar school thinking that was the best of both worlds. Those are the sort of, Britain has, as you know, a kind of class system. So the grammar schools were holdovers from being better than the comprehensive, the secondary moderns that were for the factory fodder. But my school was actually collapsing, and it turned comprehensive in a couple of years anyway, because the Labour government did away with them. It was a grammar school, and it's kind of like dying last legs as a grammar school. So it was an interesting and strange place to be. It wasn't a great school. But I look back on it and say, without that school, maybe I'd never have started the fanzine, never have had my band, because I formed a band with 2 schoolmates. So you just, you got to look back on life. Those are the things that you do. So I was just fortunate to be around. Punk was happening, fanzines were happening. I was like, let's start one. Could be fun.
Yeah, but you still have to have the gumption to put it together and to put yourself into these situations, and then actually have conversations with some people you may idolize on some level, and doing it at an age where you don't have loads of life experience, right? But you have experience in a different way. That's where I think there's an advantage to being somebody, interviewing somebody as a teenager. You're going to ask questions and get insights and produce things, I think, that, you know, somebody who was older they wouldn't even maybe be thinking of those angles.
What I found was that I was genuinely not cynical. I understood that a fanzine was a fan magazine. Slightly different concepts in the States, where they grew out of, I think, sort of the Hollywood movie industry. But in Britain, a fanzine just meant you're a fan running your own zine. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be critical, but the music press in Britain was well known for building them up and knocking them down. And there could be occasional just negative articles, like real kill articles that could possibly destroy a band's career. And I just subscribed to, I've only got so much time, so many pages. This is really hard work. You write about what you like. And so I had energy and I had enthusiasm. And I think that as I started hanging out on the scene and being able to interview people, they really enjoyed that I didn't have that cynicism, because they also had to sit down with the conventional music press and be very guarded. So I think that worked in my favor. They were like, here's this, my golden years might have been 14, 15, 16. Here's this kid. He's not a threat. He's just this sort of like bundle of enthusiasm, and he seems to be able to get the fanzine out. So let's talk to him. Yeah.
Yeah. You interviewed Paul McCartney. Was that you? Or I
that was me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I know.
That's
Even
why
now,
I want people to get a sense of, they're just like, oh yeah, this guy ran like a fan magazine. Okay, yeah, but it was more than that. You were interviewing all of these major acts, and you're a teenager, young teenager.
Absolutely. So that interview is, if you've got magnifying glasses and and scanners that can zoom things. The interview is republished in the compendium we put out, I guess, a year ago now. And yeah, I might have been able to, if we had more time, maybe I'd have got you a physical copy. But yes, that was too big to email. It's a big book with reproduced layouts and, like you say, commentary and the sort of story behind that. Confluence of incredible circumstances. I had been, I guess, taken under Paul Weller's wing somewhat of the Jam, who were the biggest group in Britain. And in early 1982, they were recording their new album at Air Studios, which is co-owned by George Martin, who was producing Paul McCartney's Tug of War album. And I was actually running an independent label with Paul Weller at the time, so I was in and out of the studio a lot. And one day I went in and this guy walks in, like he owns the place, and kind of compliments Paul Weller on what the Jam have going, and hangs out and walks out again like he owns the place, but in a really nice way, like he doesn't need permission to walk into the room. I don't mean like a boss, but that very sort of, I don't need permission to be here. And it was after he left the room, I was like, oh my God, I know who that was. I can't believe that. And Paul Weller couldn't believe it either, because he was old enough to have been a Beatles fan. And McCartney came back in the room, and by that point I said, oh my God, wouldn't it be great if I could interview him? And Weller said, you should ask him. And when he came back in, we asked him, and McCartney said yes. I interviewed him later that week for almost 3 hours.
3 hours, really?
Yeah, I know. And I actually, not surprisingly, I held on to the cassette. I mean, it's not in great shape. It would need some really professional work to get rid of the sort of hiss that's running underneath an old C9, well, two old C90s, if anybody knows what those were. But I did listen back, and I mean, he was so nice, because my cassette kind of ran out at 90 minutes, and he said to me, that's a great place to end the interview. And I was like, I'm not even halfway through my questions, and I've got another cassette. And he rolled with it. Rolled with it for about another hour. Yeah. Yeah, it was delightful. He was absolutely delightful. And when I look back on it at the time, even I felt a bit frustrated that I didn't ask him. I mean, it was the first big interview he'd given since Lennon had been assassinated just over a year earlier. And I didn't dare even ask him about that. I wasn't adult enough to ask about the pain, etc. So he would obviously talk extensively about the Beatles, and that was what I wanted to know about. At the time, I kind of look back and say, oh, these were the soft questions, but they actually weren't, because I even told him I didn't really like his solo music, and considering how popular he was, that was that was fun. It was fun. We had a bit of a back and forth about it, and he played along, which was lovely. I think he understood that at 17, I'm not going to love Mull of Kintyre. There's stuff I'm not going to love. But he was saying, he actually said this, I don't think it's as good as the Beatles, because that was just special. But, he's like, I think, some of them are good. I think it's E for effort. I mean, he's modest to the extreme. He's just like, this is what I do. I write songs. I see no reason to stop. And there he is in age 80 now doing the same thing. God bless him.
Yeah, throughout that time period, in terms of who you got to speak with and interview and interact with, was that one of the highlight moments, or if you could just share some other?
Sure. I'd be happy to share some others. To me, it's not about stardom. I think the McCartney is an exception to many of those rules. And I wasn't looking to interview the most famous people. My original idol, and still the person I sort of respect musically the most, is Pete Townsend. I interviewed him twice, and in a way I'm unhappy with both of those. I never felt I got the great interview out of Pete. And then later in life, I wrote this big biography of Keith Moon, and I've kind of kept a sort of professional and very polite distance from the Who, because they mean so much to me that I don't need to be on the inside. I sort of went through that with the Jam, and so I'm okay. Last time I met Pete, I managed to arrange for him to get a little pre-show meet with my kid, who was then about 9 years old, and was already just besotted with the Who, which I loved. And somewhere during that meet, he figured out who I was. But I'd written the book on Keith, and that's a nice relationship to have. There were some interviews that were just great interviews that aren't necessarily with the most famous people. I mean, my funniest night ever was interviewing the Damned. Captain Sensible and Dave Vanian in a demo studio just next to the Crystal Palace football ground. That's still going, by the way, at that studio. And there were 4 of us showed up. It was just a night of hilarity. And again, because it was off the cuff, it wasn't part of any official music press. It does still read very, very funny. I mean, if you know what the captain said about the Queen, who just passed away, it's not reprintable, his views on the royal family, but they were said with great, great humor. And he's a lovely person, Captain Sensible. People don't know him, the Damned, original punk band, first record out, first British punk record out. Similarly, an interview with the 2 of Killing Joke, over in their flat in Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, the very creative but also heavily West Indian neighborhood in West London, the same day that the Brixton riots of April 1981 had just taken place the Sunday. And that was by accident. So that was like, there was an energy and a tension. I had to get through Brixton or around Brixton to make it to the interview. And then at Notting Hill, not surprisingly, police everywhere in case that violence spread to there. And it spread across Britain later that summer. And Ghost Town by the Specials went to #1 that week. And so these are the moments. I mean, I remember a very feisty interview with Kevin Rowland of Dexy's Midnight Runners, who we worshipped. But he was just not an easy interview, and there's some shouting back and forth. So, and then you have these really, really pleasant ones. I interviewed Madness a few times, love them. There are lots and lots of big names. I interviewed U2 at their request, actually, and there are those sort of those bigger names. But my fondest memories come from those interviewing a group at their flat on a difficult day, or interviewing a band that's making a demo and is trying to entertain these 4 kids who've shown up demanding their time. And those are the best experiences. They speak to the fanzine culture, the do-it-yourself culture.
Yeah, I guess you always run the risk of interviewing somebody whose music or art you really respect and not knowing them as a person, and maybe getting to know them as a person on some level, and it going the wrong way for you personally, just because not everybody clicks, or maybe they were in a mood, or maybe that's just who they are, or whatever the case is. And you don't want to kind of taint your love for their art.
Yeah, and I've had a difficult relationship with Paul Weller's music for many, many years now, because the Jam just meant everything to me, everything. And that was my band. I was, we talk about fortunate again. I fell in love with them when I was 13. They broke up when I was 18, turning 19. So it was my teen love affair. And I got to be on the inside. I got to run a record label with Paul Weller, but that didn't necessarily end extremely well. And so it's been difficult in years to come. I have to compartmentalize things, which you can do. And, which you also have to do with a marriage when it ends. You have to compartmentalize that and say, it was great. That was the period. You have to separate that from the fact that something like that ends, or a relationship ends. The only way to enjoy the rest of your life is to look back on all that was positive about that. So that's difficult. But I can listen to the Jam, and all the fond memories come back, because you can't. At the time, I was on the inside. I was going, to travel to see them. That's partly how I got on the inside. I mean, I was just one of those fans that would travel up and down the country to see them. All of those memories still remain perfect.
Part of this conversation, something I want to talk about selfishly, but I also want to get advice for listeners, is advice on interviewing, because you've done how many in your estimate?
Oh
roughly?
God, hundreds. I've stopped counting. If you count all the small ones, all the times you have to call somebody up and just ask them a few questions. Yeah, I would say thousands. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you're doing these for books, for, now your podcast, which we'll talk about, 'cause we're getting into some travel stuff here. You've written books on R.E.M, Smiths, The Clash, as you mentioned, Keith Moon. All of these require extensive interviews, I'm sure. Yeah, I want to hear your advice on interviewing. I think some of this advice around interviewing can also transcend the sort of conventional, whatever you want to call it, interviewing, where you're sitting down with somebody and trying to, what I'm always going for is a conversation. And if you can have an engaging conversation, then that can benefit you outside of, even if you don't do interviews professionally or for a book or whatever. It's about just connect. making connection, right? And
It
I'm
is.
just, yeah.
I'll offer you a couple of tips. When I actually did the jamming compendium, a writer that came up through jamming, who's become very successful particularly as a magazine profile journalist over the years, Chris Heath, he had advice, and he said it was be curious, and that is excellent advice to be curious. People want to talk. That's why they're talking to you. So be interested. Don't be like, oh, this is just a job for me as a journalist. You have to be interested. So that's advice I've got from someone else. I would say fundamental. Now, podcasts are very different from the old fanzine day, because with a podcast, if you just say to me, did you like traveling for a year? I could say yes, and then you're kind of stuck. You have to say, what was it you liked about traveling for a year? Or if you didn't like something, tell us about that. Why, if it was a bad experience, tell us. That's what you have to do to open up a conversation. So avoid yes/no questions. Even in print, they don't look great. You can ask them for confirmation, but they don't look great. So always try and ask for something that invites a sentence and not just a yes/no answer. But I actually think fundamental, along with being curious, is do your homework. Just come prepared. And if you can't do the basic homework, don't do the interview. Now, as a kid, if you're starting out, you may not know anything. And we occasionally interview bands that had no history. So we would just go see them and say, you're great. Can we put you in our fanzine? So then you have to sit there and say, how did you form? What's your names? Who plays what? But then you can open up a conversation. Somewhere there will be a conversation. So I have done the occasional podcast interview where somebody hasn't done their homework and they start out getting the title of a book wrong or something. And it's not that hard just to know a little bit. And then the final thing, I think this is really good for podcasters, and I noticed that you do it, and I think all the best podcasters do it, is have your notes and then be prepared to just abandon them. Just, have the conversation. You may not get to everything you wanted to get to in that interview, but you will get to other interesting places along the way. Kind of keep an eye on your notes, make sure that you don't run out of time. You didn't get to ask that question that was really important, but be prepared to have a conversation, because I think similarly, you can tell when somebody is running through 10 prepared questions.
Yeah, that's great advice. Awesome tips. What does the homework side look like for you? You kind of mentioned preparing. I mean, again, I think this transcends just interviewing, because, you want to do your homework if you're going in for a job interview, for example, or you could even relate it to travel, right? If you know a bit about somebody's culture, you can kind of find these common grounds and these sort of common bridges where you can meet and discuss and learn from each other. Yeah. How do you go about
It's funny you mentioned homework, because I was so terrible at it at school, but that's because I was using my time to prepare for my interviews instead. So it's just funny you're using that word, and I'm very happy to talk about travel as well, and the year that we took off in 2016, because it was an amazing experience. I in both cases, I think homework is important. Now it depends who you are. I'm the kind of person who likes to walk into something a little prepared. Like, I don't want to interview Paul McCartney and not know, that's maybe not the best example because we're meant to know the Beatles, but I want to know that they had a bass player, Stu Sutcliffe, that was, sort of thrown out. I want to know I want to know when John and Paul met. I don't want to walk in and say, when did you meet John? I want to say, when you met John at this place in July 1957. That to me is important. And similarly, the worst thing I think you can do traveling is, I'm sure it's a long list, but a bad thing would be to go to an amazing place and not know about something that was incredible there. And then you leave and then you hear about it down the line. And the only reason
right there.
I was right there. It's one thing to know about it and not get to it. It's one thing to just say there were too many things and I got to some other things. But so that, to me, that homework is important. But I'm also the kind of person that when we were traveling, I would stay up reading the guidebook, the night before, and I'd be
curious
reading.
Guy, right?
Yeah. And I think that sort of speaks. You asked about being an observer, and I think there is that sort of observation aspect for sure. So for me, that homework is important. Now, I also believe you just like I said with the interviews, you have to go off script for them to work. You also, when you're traveling, you have to have a very open mind and just say, well, we wanted to do this, but this other thing presented itself and it was a better option at that time. And we totally happy to do that. Or you have to have your 3 days to just go with the flow, that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's interesting how you mentioned the sort of the homework conundrum when you were running your fanzine and you were doing the fanzine work instead of your quote unquote homework. And I mean, isn't that one of the things I'm not going to just throw all school systems under the bus because I don't think everybody's running things differently. But that, when you think about what you did and your experience running the fanzine and preparing for interviews and all this stuff, that is education. In some ways, it's the ultimate education. So for that to get sort of, I'll use the word you just used, compartmentalized, I guess, into well, that's just, extra free time stuff. But meanwhile, this is part of how you crafted a career for yourself around your creativity and your interests. And I think it's just sad. I don't want to say funny, but a bit sad that sometimes these things are looked at as not really doing the work. And I understand there are the fundamentals of, science and math and things we got to learn, but something like that should be embraced and celebrated, right? It's like you're learning.
I think it should. I agree with you. I think it should. I think the UK was not really set up for that. I was lucky we had a form teacher that's like a homeroom teacher, but it's quite an important person. And unusually we had this person for like 2 or 3 years out of the 5 years I was at my secondary school, and he was pretty supportive. I still got my one report book. He tried to be supportive. Other teachers that maybe weren't supportive, I would kind of rebel against. And it's a little different now. I've got my younger son, they're 9 years apart, and he's in senior year of high school. And we're just at this sort of college stage. He's very, very, very involved in music. And where he's looking to apply, they take into account, they want you to present your musical projects, and they take into account that the life you're living and the experiences you're having being into this may mean that your academic grades are not as high as other colleges might want. And they're looking for sort of 80s, mid 80s and above. They're not saying, come in with a bunch of Fs, but they're saying we don't set the same high standard, because what we're looking for is what have you been doing musically? And we understand that might come, they don't, let's say in quite so many words, but they sort of did in the presentation, that might come at the expense of being an A-grade math student, because your math may involve music and you're just bored by sitting there doing sums. You'd sooner actually be doing the math of getting inside a software to produce music. So I think that the culture has probably changed. And in that regard, of course, there were no college courses. There wasn't. I tell my son, there was nobody to teach you how to play guitar. There really, really wasn't. You just taught yourself back then. Nobody was teaching rock music, and now I teach at the Rock Academy, and I direct shows at the Rock Academy. I mean, the world has changed, as it should.
How do you like teaching?
I really enjoy it. The directing is something I've been doing for 3 or 4 years, and it's wild, Jason. We've got kids aged 8 to 18. Some who come from musical families and clearly have it, some who don't. All kinds of incomes. Every now and then you find out that the so-and-so's parent is a professional musician or even possibly famous. And then so-and-so comes in with a scholarship from the local school. You put them all together on a show. I'm doing an Elton John show now, but I just came off doing one for The Cure. They're meant to learn their parts away from the rehearsals, and then they come into rehearsals, about 25 kids. They rotate in and out on different instruments on different songs, and my job is to try and turn that into a presentable show so that when we do a weekend of shows with ticket prices, people are happy to come to it and impressed. And it's amazing. I get so much energy off these kids, so much energy. I think more than anything, more than traveling, more than running, I think it's what's keeping me young these days.
The Cure's coming out with a new album pretty soon. I keep seeing these videos popping up from their current tour where they're playing new songs, and they sound incredible.
Yeah, I know, it's exciting. It's exciting. That was a great show to do. And I mean, I love getting immersed in this old music, because you realize what makes music special is when you dig into the songs, not just like, oh, let's just cover that song. because we try and get the kids to learn the original parts so that they're training their ears. And it's, if you can learn this, you can unlearn it when you're a bit older. And that way you just learn why was that song a hit record? I never really asked myself why it was. And you start coming up with the reasons. These just little variations that are in there. You'll understand what I'm talking about. But I love that aspect of it, because I'm able to hopefully convey to the kids, that little part you've got there is what made that a number one record. Take that away, it was just another song,
Okay, well then, how do we write a number one hit record? You can just tell me right now. Let's just we'll finish this up. We're gonna knock it out. We're gonna write this hit song, and then we'll be back with a couple $1 million.
You could do what what's his name, Bill Drummond, who was a musician before he became a rock manager and an A&R person, and then decided to become a musician again in the rave scene, and pretty much set out to get a number one record with a rework of the Doctor Who theme in the rave style in the late 80s, and then wrote the manual how to get a number one record. He's very like a sort of situationist kind of person. So, and then they earned so much money unexpectedly. They then famously went and burned £1 million. They became millionaires and went and burned £1 million and made a film out of it. Literally, I'm not joking. They burned £1 million. It took a long time as well. It's quite a boring film.
Thank God.
Yeah, I know.
You could have donated it, for crying out loud.
Well, there is that argument. It's the same argument about Pete Townsend smashing up guitars. Why don't you give it to a kid who deserves it? It's a different thing. Who else has ever burned £1 million? Then again, I just read a piece from somebody who turned $15,000 into 1.2 million on all this like stock betting recently, the whole GameStop kind of thing, and then lost every penny and now owes taxman money. So I actually think if you're going to go that route, burning £1 million is more interesting.
Yeah, there's an artist, I can't remember, what's his name?
That was the KLF, by the way, that they became. If people know the KLF, but
No.
look them up.
Okay.
Late 80s, early 90s.
Literally wrote a book called How to Write a Number One Record.
Yeah, I think it's called The Manual, How to Write a Number One Record. Yeah, or How to Make a Number One Record. Yeah.
I've got to add that to my Amazon list.
Bill Drummond's an amazing person, utterly unique, one of a kind.
I just read about an artist who's burning his artwork right now. It's
Well, I go to Burning Man, and that's part of Burning Man, is these incredible pieces of art get made and then they get burned.
How long have you been going?
So I just went for the back for the first time in 10 years. I went from 2007 to 2012. I went 7, 8, 9. It was 4 years out of 5 or 5 out of 6. It was 5 out of 6 with my older son, who was only 11 the first year we went. So he kind of spent a week every summer out on the Nevada desert at Burning Man. And we would camp, by the way. We did this hardcore camping. And we had to, we would come back pretty unclean. And then we went as a family in 2012, made a road trip of it. The road trip is a wonderful part of travel, great to do with kids. As is taking them around the world as well. So we made a road trip out of that one because we knew the older one was going off to college, and Burning Man happens right when college goes into its first week every year. So we knew that was ending. Burning Man is one of those things that can change your life. The first time I went, it was a life changer. And I would say that I would not have embarked on that round the world journey without Burning Man. Burning Man taught me a lot of self-survival skills, and it also literally somebody there gave me the idea, and they didn't literally say take your family around the world, but it gave me the idea, and I decided to do it. When I went back this year, it was interesting. In some ways, I hadn't been for 10 years and very little had changed. It was just bigger, but I missed having my son with me, even as a young adult. We did that together. We would have some time apart, especially as he got older, and I could leave and be a little bit more. But I missed having that, and I came back and it felt a bit more like this weird fever dream holiday. Like, yeah, I did that. It was amazing. Oh, now I've got to get back to work. And I'm wrestling with that a little bit, because I don't think Burning Man should ever be just a week of, hedonism and bacchanalia, and then you kind of go back to the default world. It's meant to have that lasting impression about how you then create the rest of your life and interact with the default world, as we call it. But without suggesting that people literally go to Burning Man, I think doing something like that can be a life changer. It can just make you completely rethink why you're here, what you're doing, and what to do with the rest of your life.
One of those things sounds like for you mentioned is the 2016 backpacking around the world trip with your wife and 11-year-old son at the time.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I wanted to hear a bit more about that experience. Does it fall into that category you just mentioned of life-changing?
Yes.
Yeah.
It does. It does. There's honestly, Jason, there's rarely a day goes by that I don't just a place, an incident, a moment will pop into my head, and I'll just look back on it fondly. I have no lasting bad memories of the trip. It went very, very, very well. I'll say that doing it with an 11-year-old gives you this responsibility, the same as the first time I went out to Burning Man. I took the 11-year-old, and my wife was like, you better bring him back alive. And, and then we ended up going, and she came out the final year. It's ex-wife, by the way, now. And the same with the going around the world. We had to do this well. But what we did is we backpacked. We went very economical. We didn't do dorms in hostels because I don't think that would be fair on an 11-year-old. I'm not even sure that we would be allowed. But we stayed in guest houses, in the occasional hostel, but guest houses, very inexpensive hotels. In New Zealand, we did the camper van rental for 40 days and 40 nights in a beat up old van because we were running short of money. And New Zealand's not cheap. This van was on its last legs, but it got us through the journey. We traveled by bus. We almost always traveled by public transport. I mean, I remember in Thailand, like turning down the luxury bus from one coast to another because we wanted to go by public transport. And it was a sort of a disaster. And yet it was really good because when it turned into a disaster, it was just unbelievably hot and our kid had a meltdown. And there was a woman who spoke English and tried to help. And she had studied in, I think it was Liverpool University. She was Thai. But so here was this connection. And she was doing research about women's rights in the disputed area that was a low-grade sort of civil war in the south of Thailand. Fascinating. You wouldn't have those conversations unless sort of something goes wrong. So, that was a big part of it. But yeah, we had to do our homework for that and had to plan well. We couldn't just freewheel the way that I think a younger backpacker can. But it went remarkably well.
What are the key lessons from that trip in terms of, well, we can take it in two ways. One would be advice for anybody planning a gap year type of thing, maybe some things people should be aware of. And then on the other side, just life lessons coming out of that.
Sure. So my advice for people in their gap year may not be applicable because, of course, being at such a different age, we met people doing some form of gap year travel, long-term travel. They were almost envious of our 11-year-old, but no reason to be. And they're like, "Oh man, you got the cool parents." And I was like, "Look, you guys are doing your gap year. I never did. So you take credit for what you're doing. You're out traveling." I met people who gave up jobs good jobs in their 20s because they said, "I don't want to go down this path. I at least need to see the world." And I'm like, "It took me till I was 50 to get to Africa, to get to Asia." That was part of it, Jason. I for all that I've made the move from London to New York and seen much of the the United States and Western countries and a bit of South America, I hadn't been to Africa, I hadn't been to Asia, and I was really worried about never getting there. Really worried because I like the world. The world's a beautiful place. So we needed to do it in a major way. We kept looking at holidays in Thailand or holidays in Africa, and we couldn't afford them. And then we realized that if we rented out the house or hoped to rent out the house and traveled cheap, once we got over the initial cost of getting to Europe in our case, for a good reason, it would be more economical and we could do this. And so that's what we did. A gap year person may have no rent or house to worry about in the first place. So income is very different. My advice, though, that I do have some sort of fun, some basic advice. Apart from saying, I think it's good to do your homework, and that even if you're only 19, 20 years old, you probably should see that 2,000-year-old temple. You probably should check out something else that's in the guidebooks. But one of the great things I got, it may have been from Rolf Potts's book, it may have been from that one, is allow a day to travel. Build in extra travel time, because travel moves more slowly and less precisely in many countries. And I would say embrace those moments. And I would encourage people not to take the private travel, even when it's so cheap comparatively. So let's say you had a few $1,000s saved up and you go to India. Well, you can afford to take taxis in India. You can probably afford to fly from city to city. But you will come back so much more worldly wise and experienced, and hopefully happier if you take the bus and the train and the tuk-tuk, and occasionally jump on the back of somebody's scooter, for a legitimate taxi ride. Some of my very, very most interesting, best experiences happened in transit. And I've written about a few of those, and I read some of those stories on the podcast I do. Those were some of the most incredible experiences happened in transit. And if we'd said, it's only going to cost us $25 more to take a taxi than the three of us buy these bus tickets and change twice in Morocco, for example, for a very vivid example, I would never have had that conversation with this 19-year-old Moroccan kid who could speak perfect English and, ended up wanting to ask me about what I thought about Muslims, which is, those are the conversations you kind of want to have and you're a bit scared of having. 2016, that was a more loaded question than it might be in 2022, and would not have happened if we had just done what other people we'd met at the Dar we had just been staying at. We're like, we just came back up from the desert. Yeah, it was only $100 for the taxi. It's what you should do. And I'm like, yeah, it's really inexpensive for like a 400-mile drive, but we're going to take two buses. It was actually meant to be a bus and a train, but it all went belly up. And it was just, it was one of those travel days that I look back on fondly. And then I made my kid keep a journal as part of his mobile schooling. And he just wrote down there, at the end of it, he wrote all about it. We went to Fez from Chef Shower, and he wrote, we took a train, took a bus, did this, ate apple pie. It was just a travel day. And I was like, I must be doing something right, because that was hard work. We missed the train. We had to take a grand taxi. Where people skirt around the mountains at 80 miles an hour, and you think you're going to die, and there's 7 of you in a car that should hold 4. Wonderful experiences. So that's a big recommendation to people.
Yeah, I love the idea of having your son keep a journal so you can look back on that. And it's just a perfect example of how everybody sees things different, even though it's the same shared experience, right? Just a travel day. You're like, that was a crazy travel day.
And one of the best I want to talk about, this is one I do look back on a lot. We ended up going from, I think it's pronounced Paia. I get it confused sometimes with the place in Hawaii. It's in the northwest of Thailand, and it's a real sort of traveler's destination. We went there, I guess, from Chiang Mai, and it's one of these little towns that, like every other place in town, is a sort of tourist eatery full of backpackers. And one place I got a little confused about the purpose of being there, and we were going to go to Cambodia, and I got turned off the idea of going to Cambodia. And I said, look, they're offering, we can get to Laos from here. It's a day on a coach and a night and a 2-day boat journey down the Mekong River. And I do suspect that it's going to be nothing as luxurious as they're trying to convince me. And it wasn't. And there were problems with that. One of the worst nights we had was the night before getting the boat. But we took this 2-day trip down the Mekong River, and 80% of the other people on the boat were young travelers. And I had been getting a little cynical about them in this town we just came from. But over the course of 2 days, maybe 90%, there was one older retired American or Australian couple and 1 or 2 locals using a boat. But everybody else was doing this journey where you get from Paia, if that's pronounced right, in Thailand, down to Luang Prabang in Laos. Over those 2 days, I got to have so many great conversations with these younger people. All my cynicism evaporated, all of it. Every one of them was on some kind of journey. And even if that journey felt, even if their journey sort of seemed a little hedonistic, I was also like, hey, remember, they're young. And I'd like to say some of them had quit jobs. People had, I met a guy maybe in his 30s, a Scottish guy who had his bike with him. And he's like, this travel's easy. I just like cycle and I got a tent in my backpack. And, if need be, I just pitch my tent somewhere. Life's good. I do this like a few months a year. So people way braver than we were doing, way braver. And that one really sticks in mind. If you don't put aside those 2 days, so what are you doing? You're just sitting on a boat having conversations. Our kid brought his guitar. His backpack was actually an acoustic guitar. We had to carry his clothes for him, and he would just entertain people. So he whips out the guitar on the boat and he's singing songs, and you can't replicate that. Those are the is it MasterCard? I should know. Is it MasterCard or Visa? Some experiences are priceless. They run the cost of the cost of this, the experience priceless, and that's how I feel about that trip.
Yeah, and it was a whole year.
10.5 months. I really wanted to make it like 365 days. But we in the first month, my wife, and I guess with my younger son, but my wife made it clear she wanted to be back for Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
She was American. She is still American. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was 10.5 months, and we got back in time for Thanksgiving.
And can I ask you about the breakup thing?
Yes, you
was after that, I guess. Just, this is a topic that I think, you just never know what's going to come out of a trip like that. Right.
Absolutely.
It sounds like for you, there was a lot of these positive memories, and then also, I'm not putting spin on it. It's your story. You tell me about the experience coming out and how the travel kind of, played in or maybe helped those decisions you made afterwards.
Yeah. I did tip you off that I'd be happy to talk about this because I think a lot of friends I have locally are just really scared to go there. They kind of looked at it that we went off around the world for 10.5 months, came back, and about 6 months later announced that we were breaking up after 25 years. And the obvious moral of that story is don't take your family around the world because you'll break up your marriage. I want to preface what I say next by I love it when my friends make it to 30 years of marriage, 35 years of marriage. If you can find that perfect person and you go the distance, God bless you, or whoever you believe in, bless you. I would have been very, very happy to have that. So when I hear of people that are newly married, they got young kids, this is not to say this is where your life will end up, because hopefully it won't. But at the same time, I'm not sure all of us are meant to be together forever. And it's very easy to assume that you will be together forever because you have a life together. You're raising kids. You've got a house. You may have another property. You may be in business together. And so you just assume, and you can become semi-happy and semi-unhappy with that relationship, and you can let it drift. And I suspect that had we not gone on the trip around the world, we would have let that drift for a long, long time subsequently. And we knew we weren't totally happy together anymore. And we had the occasional sort of session and trying to get out of it. And we committed to the trip. We had enough experience to make the trip work really, really well. And of course, we had our son with us, our youngest son. So, that was, there was no sort of, no sense that this wouldn't be seen through the whole way. We had bought, certain tickets and we wanted to see it through. But something crystallized to me like halfway through the trip. I know exactly when it did. The unhappiness I was feeling, actually, there was a solution. And the solution was to, when we got back from the trip, the solution was to say, no, I think, we've now done everything together. And I think it's time we go our separate ways, and it's probably best for the younger kid as well. This idea of staying together for the kids. My older son, when I told him he was just graduating college, said, yeah, you often hear about parents staying together for the kids, but people don't always ask the kids what they think is best. And, you and mom, this is probably best, that you go your separate ways. I really do think if I hadn't gone on that trip. And the trip was my idea. And I really wanted us to do it as a family. The same as when I first went to Burning Man, and I wanted to go to Burning Man. Then I was like, it'll be more fun with the kid. And I really wanted to travel. I was like, I have to start seeing these countries and continents. India, I've got to get to India. I've got to before something happens to me. And we decided to do it as a family, and it did work really well. But it did crystallize. And I think that I would not discourage anybody else, because we met other families that were doing the trip, and one of them was doing they spent 2.5 years together with 2 kids, and I interviewed them for my podcast, and everything still seemed to be great. We met another family. They did surprise me by, I found out like 2 years, I went to visit them at one point. They just bought a new place, and then a year later I found out they'd broken up, but that may or may not have had anything to do with travel. So that was our experience. And once I internalized it halfway through the trip, I realized that I didn't need to be frustrated about my situation, or feel that maybe we had moved into this totally sort of platonic relationship. I think part of it was, we're either going to have a second honeymoon. I think I went into this. I wasn't bold enough to put this up front, but I think I went into it saying, either this is going to be like a sort of second honeymoon and we will rekindle the passion for each other because we're going to be in such close quarters, or it will crystallize what we've both been concerned about, that maybe we're running our course. It turned out to be the latter, but I don't know that would ever have happened. And maybe I would still be in one of those 50-50 marriages where you kind of grind along because that's what you do, and it's too much hassle to call it a day and split everything up.
Yeah, there is something about the forced sort of reflection that travel provides, right? It's pretty, you're on this trip, you're together, you have this time. If you go into that block of time with open questions, chances are you're going to come out with some answers at the end, where, I mean, you can do that in your regular life, but for some reason it's a lot harder because it's just sort of the daily, I don't know, and maybe I'm just speaking from the traveler's perspective and having had transformations through travel, that to me it's something about the physical distance and the time, and sort of the time blocked out, and yeah, all of it.
Yeah, I was listening to another show that I really liked that 2 women run, and they did an episode about sort of trying to get to the reason why we're way more adventurous when we're traveling. Why do we do these things when we travel and not at home? And, there are some very obvious reasons once you start asking each other about this. You don't have the peer group pressure. Nobody's going to judge you. But I also think that getting out of your comfort zone, being somewhere else, this is why Burning Man was transformative for me. Certainly initially, it puts you in a space where you can think differently. And a lot of people who do the travel do it because they get frustrated by their life, by their job, not always their relationship, because if they're in a new relationship, they might not want to risk it by either traveling together for too long or leaving their partner behind. But a lot of people do the travel because they're looking for that transformative experience, and I would say it's there. And I'm okay about what we did. I mean, would I have preferred option 1? Well, it didn't happen. That's like,
right. It doesn't matter.
It wasn't destined, right? Yeah. It wasn't destined to be the second honeymoon. But I swear, absolutely, hand on heart, that rarely, if ever, a day goes by that some little moment doesn't pop into my mind, and it's always a positive memory, always.
That's really cool that you're still almost on the daily kind of getting this trip still impacting you in that way. Those are the best kind of trips, really.
I would say we came, I would have stayed on the road almost forever. I was in my element, and I didn't even know that was true about myself. I did kind of have to get back because I had a book coming out that had been delayed because apparently I'd gone off gallivanting around the world. And we had to get back we did have to get back, but this other family did it for 2.5 years. They moved much more slowly than us. I was just having the time of my life. It didn't help that the US election of 2016 took place on our last day in New Zealand, right before we came home. I mean, that was like, really, we're coming back to this America? So of course, for the next, weeks, months, and probably 4 years, I was like, when can I go again? My son's finishing off high school, back in the more conventional schooling, and I'm really looking forward to doing more long-term travel at some point before long. I went back to Tanzania to climb Kilimanjaro. I've been to Colombia twice, partly because a friend moved there, but I particularly want to get back to India and see more of India. There's so many more countries as well.
You mentioned your podcast a few times, and we'll just remind people it's called One Step Beyond, which documents people who take a step outside their comfort zone to enrich their life. It seems like you have been living a lot of your life outside of your comfort zone, at least to me, even starting in your teenage years, kind of putting yourself in and maybe, there's the naivete of being a teenager and just not getting as nervous for interviews like this you were doing or something. I don't know, but I imagine you felt like you were outside of your comfort zone quite a bit. I guess talk about the importance of that. You've touched on it in your own life with your own travels, but it's another level to have a whole podcast around it. And yeah, I just want to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. It really came about for two reasons. One was musical, that I had been able to land one of the best gigs I've had in the last 10 years or so, and work with the Pixies, the group The Pixies, on a podcast where, for their previous album, Beneath the Eyrie, that they recorded in the Woodstock area, we recorded every single moment that took place in the studio. So that's like 10 hours a day for 3 weeks. And
wow.
And that was recorded in the control room and the studio. And then
were you with them during that?
So there was a recorder, like the engineer had to, the intern had to switch on those recorders when the day started. But my job was to come and go and talk with the band and just like have my own recorder, and just like become hopefully become trusted by them and talk with them. And so this way we were able to combine the process of recording an album with the physical process, so you could hear the conversations in the studio, with the interviews with the band and their process and how they were on a given day. And we turned it into a 12-part series. And I came out of that realizing that I I shouldn't talk for myself, but possibly had another skill I didn't realize I'd had, because I wasn't initially meant to put the show together, and nothing ever works as planned, not even with big rock bands and big podcasts. And suddenly I was editing the show, like doing the initial rough edit of the show. And I was like, oh, I actually can do this. So when I did Kilimanjaro, I took the same recorder with me and made a 4-part documentary, and did that with the help of Radio Kingston here, used their studios. And then when the pandemic hit, I had been thinking about so that 4-parter had gone out. I'd been thinking about turning that into a podcast. And like what I suspect may have been hundreds of thousands of people used the pandemic to launch a podcast, realize the field is very, very crowded. You have to be pretty good at it. And kept it going, and then did take a break to switch over to one that promoted that jamming book that you talked about, which I've also thought about relaunching that, because I think there's a lot more conversations to be had about, say, the fanzine press. So it wouldn't be just about jamming. It would be about, underground press, and whether it's current or people my age that did it when they were younger. But I've gone back. I'm 4 or 5 episodes in now to the second season. And a lot of it's about, the other tagline is positively engaging with the world outside our door. And you talk about, I may sound like I've stepped outside my comfort zone a lot. I'm very self-critical, because a lot of my episodes seem to fall back on, I live next to the Catskills Mountains. I lived in the heart of them with my family. I'm a trail runner. I love that. It's very easy for me to do episodes about hiking, running. Maybe there's a variation. Somebody's a barefoot hiker, so let's talk to them. I am genuinely interested in people who take kind of, genuine steps with their lives. And I sort of feel I should do more if I wanted to do this documentary style. I need to go rock climbing, or I don't know. I did learn
gonzo journalism,
Yeah, a bit more of that. But you would know as well as me. it was great. My first season went out on Radio Kingston, and there was a small stipend with that, which helped. And the editing of a documentary style where you record several hours with a recorder and then you have to clean up the recording is very different than most people who will just record a call and then publish it like 4 hours later. And given the finances of the podcast business, the latter is by far the more sensible option. And I'm just finishing off an episode about a festival that takes place right here in Kingston called O Positive, which exchanges the art of medicine for the medicine of art. It's what you have to do in a country that doesn't have a socialized healthcare system. And I realized that my attempt to make an episode about Burning Man, Burning Man's the wrong place in a way to do that. And that actually let's focus on the local festival. But there's still 2.5 hours of tape that needs to come down to, an hour or less. So that's a process, but there's been a lot of good stories with a lot of interesting people, I think, including that family that traveled around the world. I reconnected with them to hear their story. Just go out at the time traveling in the age of COVID, but that was a British guy who just basically has managed to stay on the road most of his life, apart from going back to check on his father. He somehow makes it work, and he's up around my age, and he's 100+ countries. And it was funny when I interviewed him, he'd never been to Latin South America, and I was amazed, Central or South America, and he got to 100 countries and he was kind of scared. And I was like, how can you be scared? You have gone by bus up and down Africa twice. How can you be scared? And he sort of was. He ended up in Mexico as he was trying to stay ahead of COVID. And he ended up in Mexico, and he's been in Central South America ever since. So it just goes to show you can have these fears, step outside your comfort zone. You may be really happy there.
What ways are you outside of your comfort zone lately?
That's a really good question, because I don't know that I do challenge myself enough with that. Where I could do it and be, and yet still sort of be furthering it, being in the ultra sort of running thing. Like last year, I did my first 100K. I mean, I think sort of taking on tougher events, but you see, I don't think that does put me outside.
Come on, man.
I don't think that does put me outside, because they're all like gradual increases on something that I've done before. I feel that there's a lifestyle change coming up that will involve that, and it's a long time coming, and it involves having the younger son very settled in whatever he does after high school, and I've got a steady empty nest, but I've also got a partner here. And, these are questions that can sometimes be so big that you just, keep putting them off. But I would like to get through. So probably the best answer for that. I mean, on our travels, I would say it would be scuba diving, because I'm not, underwater was not something I'd really done before. That was a big experience. And it's cheap to do when you're abroad. That's one of those kind of things. If you find yourself in like Thailand, and go to one of the islands, take advantage, because the course was probably like 1/8 of the cost of what it would be in the States. And it was fun, and the waters were beautiful. So that's an aside. I think that stepping outside the comfort zone maybe to come with this next stage of life. It may be, one of the later chapters in life, I would like to be able to wrap things up at a grand old age by saying I didn't just live full-time in Great Britain and United States. They're two countries with the same language, similar cultures. And for all that I've traveled, I would like to be able to say I lived somewhere else. My brother would say he's not half as adventurous as me, but he's lived in, he's lived in Mexico, he's lived in the United States, he's lived in England, he lives in Sweden. I know a lot of that was work and corporate work, but he still answered the call when they said, you want to move to Mexico with a baby and a 3-year-old? He went, yeah, let's do it. So I have not taken those risks, and I would like to be able to wrap up living in at least one other country. And that might really involve stepping outside my comfort zone, and maybe downscaling even further, move into a culture where my friend who moved to Colombia did so in part because he'd sold a business, but with sort of annual or monthly payments. And it was like, how do I let that see me out? Like, I don't want to go back to work at this point. You know, not that I want to be focused on my art. Well, he's ended up opening a center for the arts in Colombia. He can't help being an entrepreneur, but he's mixed the best of both worlds. So he's got a center for the arts, almost like what do you call it? He's trying to set it up as an intentional community. And it's in the countryside, 3 hours outside of Bogota. And he's chosen a good time to move to Colombia. And yes, your money goes a lot further and you can make this work. So I think that's down the line.
Yeah. Interesting. Excited to see where it goes for you, man. That doesn't sound too far down the line.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And there are more books to write, and there's always this sense. I wrestle with this. I mean, maybe I come across caffeinated and like, life's hunky dory, and I've written some good books, but there's always the sense of, well, am I sort of meant to just be writing another book about a great rock band? I struggled to write a book about the year on the road, but I think that's because of what it revealed. And I can't really write that without getting very personal. And I don't know if that's the right thing to do. So I got to write some good short stories that I felt were the moments in between, those transit moments. And, maybe there is a book there about all the best moments happening in transit. What I would love to do that wouldn't involve totally stepping outside my comfort zone, what I would love to do is be able to sell a project up front that involved travel with a theme, with an experience, that the publisher would say, yeah, okay, you do that. We'll trust you to write it when you get back. Here's the deal. And whatever that deal is would help finance the trip. And that would be my ideal next venture. Even if it was a couple of years from now, that would be it.
You mentioned the books. We talked about them a bit, books on a lot of different amazing artists. What has written all those books, all of those stories from these people, these bands? What has that taught you?
Another great question. Funny enough, not one I really know that I've been asked. I would say what it's taught me is that life is great. We are undeniably screwing up this planet, and we may not be here for long. I think nature will shrug us off, which it's done with species before. But on a sort of macro level, life is beautiful. It's not for everybody, people born in poverty, etc. That doesn't mean you can't do your part to help make their life better and enjoy your life as a result. Enjoy your time here. Be creative. And I think, a lot of the people I've written about have followed their artistic muse. And it's much easier for us to hear about the success stories. For every Smiths or R.E.M., there are multiple groups that didn't make it. You may have personal experience with that. I do. They're small margins. They're very, very small margins that separate sort of success from failure. But follow your muse. I believe you only pass through here once. And if I get back to that travel thing, no sooner did we set off on our journey than somebody I knew in the UK my age died over a weekend. I think he had I never quite figured that out. But I did not want to be in that position where, let's say I got hit by a bus and I realized I was dying on the road. And my last thoughts might be, I never got to India. Whether or not it would have mattered half an hour later, it would have mattered to me in that particular moment. And interestingly enough, I had a very weird brain hemorrhage a year ago. It was not related to an aneurysm, which means it wasn't life-threatening. But I didn't know that for a little period of time. And maybe because I had got to India and Africa, it was interesting. When I was being rushed to the hospital, my thought was, damn, I still haven't finished that second memoir. So when I came out of the process, I made sure to do that. Do the things that you want to do, because these years pass by really, really quickly. They really, really do. And don't keep putting things off because you may miss the opportunity. I guess that's, all the people I've written about did that stuff. All the kids who made music in New York City, they seized the moment. All those bands seized the moment and they committed to it. And I guess those are the kind of life lessons you get.
Is that what has allowed you to continue crafting a career for yourself, essentially? It seems like you've done so many cool projects. And
yeah, I think I'm hopeless at the business side of it and not motivated enough by the money. I think I'm just motivated by trying to do interesting things. I hope they're interesting. And sometimes they take off, sometimes they do. And some books do really well and some don't do so well. And it's not always about the amount of work you put in or even the reviews, to be quite honest. But, I've also, we got to the point that we had the big house in the country and it was lovely. It was a great period of life, but that comes with like considerable expenses and the accounting for that wears on you. And I downscaled afterwards, and that made my life a lot freer. And so I think that there were also some lessons about live within your means. There's a whole conversation out there about these studies that have been done that making more money doesn't necessarily make people happier. And I actually read in the last 48 hours, it may have been about this person who bankrupted himself, going from like 15,000 to 1.2 million and then losing it all. And his parents had been anti-materialistic, so they were really embarrassed when he told them that he was rich. And I think he quoted that the study in the state says that threshold is $75,000, which can be a lot of money for some people. And for investment bankers is like, a tip on a bottle of wine or something ridiculous. But there is that kind of study. And I think that, not everybody needs to go and feel that they've got to have a six-figure salary and all the benefits that come with it to hopefully live a fulfilling life.
Do you miss anything about British culture desperately?
Yeah, I do.
What do you miss?
The thing I miss most is the pub. A lot of other things like the football, which is a big part of my life. I follow Crystal Palace. We get the games now, so they're weird times of day, but I get to watch my team, so that's not a problem. I kind of miss going to the matches, but it's okay. I go once or twice a year. The pub culture I miss. We just don't have the same thing, and I miss the idea that going out after your dinner just for like even at our age, maybe just the one beer, not the 4 or 5 I'd have had in my teens, but just the one beer is a part of everyday life that is normal, completely, thoroughly normal. I have to remind myself that some of my friends don't do that much anymore anyway, because when I do go back over, I'm usually able to put a few of us together, and I probably end up trying to cram too much of that into a short stay, which, has its repercussions. But what are you going to do? There's a lot of great pubs and a lot of good friends and a lot of good beer.
Listen, when you get back to your home country, you've been outside of it for months or years, you do want to cram in all those experiences for better or worse, right? I know that feeling. Believe me, it's like how many Mexican meals can I eat in a week?
Sure. And a friend in Beverly, where my mother's in a care home, and this trip I'm about to take, I'm not sure I'm going to get to London, which my brother's going to come over from Sweden and overlap, and we haven't done the 3 of us, let alone the 2 of us, for a while. My mother's got dementia, and it's that's really sad. I've made my own friends in Beverly in Yorkshire, this ancient town. There's a pub on the street where I was born that is genuinely like 700-800 years old. And my friend just sent me, and they closed for renovations. And I was looking at the photo he sent me. I was like, oh no, it's going to be closed now. I see they reopened the day I get there. He said they're doing this just for you, Tony. Hopefully they're not. Hopefully the renovations are minor, because when you walk into this place, it's old.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I love the pub culture there. It's not so much about the drinking as it is about just the socializing.
Yeah.
The social aspect, the common meeting place, I guess, for everybody. It's just, it's magical.
I miss that. And moving from off the mountain into a small city again, where there's lots going on, I miss that still is not part of the culture. When I was younger, living in New York City, I mean, you were just out all the time. It wasn't like pubs but you were just always out. So you're always meeting people, always socializing. But it doesn't go on, and I miss it. You have to make a big deal about getting together with somebody, and then it almost feels weird doing it. Like, oh my God, are we being irresponsible by going for a beer on a Wednesday night? British don't think twice about that.
So that's the part you miss the most, the normalization The daily beer, right?
Yeah, I mean the only other, yeah, and I could take the beer out of the equation because I do go through like just work periods where I might be like a couple of weeks without having a drink, and it doesn't bother me at all. But I find it hard in the UK to be in a pub and not have a beer. I've done it, but I find that hard. The only other thing I would say I miss, because I was relatively happy to leave the place, and I'm a bit I was around the band culture enough, and then around that here, I don't think I need to be around the music scene in the UK particularly. When the weather is nice in the UK, the place is beautiful. You may get some of that in Norway as well. The weather is often grim, grey, dreary, drizzly, all these similar words in the UK. So when the weather's nice, everybody is in such a good mood. And I think in places like California, Florida, some other places, people take that for granted. And so they're not always in a good mood on a good day. When the first spring days come and there are blue skies. I remember I was in Brighton one day on a Monday that was exceptionally warm and blue, and it just looked like the whole of Brighton took the day off work. They were all on the beach by midday on Monday, shirtless. The Brits were like their white bodies. There's a sense of joy there that with the weather. So if you're lucky enough to get a trip where the weather is nice, especially in summer, up in Yorkshire, it really is beautiful. There's beautiful landscapes, and you can't unfortunately predict it too much. Maybe with climate change, you can predict more hot weather, but you can't predict it enough. But when you land on it, that's a good reason to be in the UK.
Well, it's a great place I like to visit, and I'm so glad that you reached out and that you were able to take the time to chat here today. I feel like we have a lot more to talk about, but I do want to respect your time and maybe get some more stories from you in one of those pub nights.
Yeah, that would be lovely, wouldn't it? That would be lovely. I appreciate you doing this. I actually just reached out to you at a final point of I've listened to this show so often, and there were so many good guests. I need to just let Jason know I'm another listener. But I've got to say, when you came back and said, let's get you on the show, I was like, oh, wow. Oh, very up for that.
Oh, my pleasure. I mean, it's always nice to meet a fellow podcaster as well. And you've done so much incredible work over the years, and really enjoyed just kind of diving in and getting to, learn more about your career and some of the things you've done. And I'm sure you got stories for days. So we could have you back.
I can bore don't worry, I can bore for England.
TonyFletcher.net, of course, we'll link in the show notes. I think that's the best kind of call to action, right? Because that has all your books and link to the podcast and everything like that. Yes. Who are you listening to nowadays, by the way? I know you guys dropped the Dear Boys. Isn't that your band?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that was so much fun getting back with my
got the band back together again.
Getting the band back together. Well, somebody who joined my band later as a vocalist, because I couldn't sing really at that point to save my life, but stayed my best friend, and he's carried on playing in bands, and we just decided we had unfinished business and recorded a record in the UK earlier this year, and didn't just release it online. We pressed up some vinyl, and he's put a couple of books together. They're like train spotter books about these rare do-it-yourself records. The books are called Anaraki in the UK, which is a great title if you know what an anorak is. It's both an item of clothing, but it's also a term of less than endearment for train spotters. And so he's very immersed in that.
Little play on words there.
Little play on words. He put together a really lovely package for the record. And one reason I got to get back to the south of England is we got more songs to do. In terms of what I'm listening to, there's this group that, it's a project that is out of the UK called SAULT, SAULT, all with capital letters. It's a sort of anonymous, almost like a Banksy style thing, although I do think people know who the producer is. Released one of the albums of 2020, untitled Black Ears, that was tied in with the Black Lives Matter movement. This last week, it dropped 5 albums on the same day, all available for download for 5 days only, which may have passed, unfortunately, but you had to guess the password from the message. And somebody actually gave it away on social media, and which I'm sure was the intent. And I'm wading through the 5 albums by SAULT. It's amazing. They may end up, I don't think they're bothered if they get shared around. So I would look for those. I saw a couple of cool acts during this O Positive festival. I was taken by a woman called Delicia, Del, I think Itia. I do a lot of listening to other shows, and I let other people be my kind of curators these days. I did put together a playlist over the past summer because I just wanted to actually remember some of these acts. So I can quote a couple to you. The Suffers are really interesting. There was, I'm trying to think, there's a band called The Gift that I really like. No, they're called Gift, just Gift, and that might be with capitals. And I really like them, a younger band. And I listen to a lot of ambient music during the day so that I can work to it. There's a website called Flow State that gives you an artist every 2 days so that you can work to that artist. And the band that I most loved over the last 5-10 years, they played New York about a month ago, and I hadn't realized 2 months ago. I was really upset to miss them this time round. Idols. Do you know the group Idols?
No.
IDLES. They're big. They were like album of the year for even KEXP here in the States a couple of years back. They're on to their fourth album, fourth album, which means they're not quite as young as some. Very, very loud. The closest I think I'll ever get to seeing the MC5, because I'm obviously not going to see the MC5. Amazing group. They're up to like headlining some pretty big shows in the UK, and certainly packing some decent sized venues in the States. Amazing group. Recovered addicts. The front man's a recovered heroin addict. Wonderful love. They're like loud and filled with love. That combination of like we're all about the mosh pit, and the mosh pit is for the girls, and you respect the girls in the mosh pit. It's that kind of thing, and they're all guys, big guys. It's Idols. They're one of those groups that'll keep you young, I think.
Love it. Thanks. I just was, as you were announcing those out, I was searching and following all of them, so I've got them all on my follow now. I'll check them out. And I love that you still got your finger on the pulse of all the music going on. Can't let it go.
A lot of it comes from other people these days, but I mean, and maybe wrapping up with that observation aspect. I don't have to be down the front anymore. Sometimes it's enough to just hear that a band means it. That's enough for me. I say that to my son a lot. It's like, I don't have to love this. It's enough for me to know that they're authentic, or he or she or it is authentic, and then I'm a fan. I'm supportive.
I love that. You can take the boy out of the fanzine. You can't take the fanzine out of the boy, right?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Cool. Tony, thank you so much. We'll link to the website. Of course, you can find the podcast and everything like that. And the books, if you're a music fan, you might be interested in checking out some of those. And just thanks, man. Glad we're connected.
I'm glad we're connected as well, Jason. Thanks so much for having me on, and you run a great show. Just glad you keep it going. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
There you have it. Hope you enjoyed my conversation with Tony Fletcher. A quick thanks to him, and I'm excited to call him a new friend. I'm glad we're in touch. Don't forget to check out his podcast, One Step Beyond, all about people getting out of their comfort zones and sharing the lessons from that, really in line with a lot of the stuff that we talk about here on the show. Of course, getting out of your comfort zone, one of the big parts of living an unconventional life, which I think a lot of us here in this listening community, myself included, resonate with. That's what I like about Tony's punk rock attitude. I guess being around so much of the punk rock influence and all the work he's done, I mean, you can't help but kind of open your eyes to the fact that, hey, maybe some of these so-called rules are just made up by society or people or institutions that don't necessarily always have an individual's best interests at heart. Let's put it that way. And you don't have to walk around with a purple mohawk and safety pins in your jacket to benefit, I think, from the biggest lesson that punk rock or just unconventionality has taught me, which is to question things. That doesn't mean that I have to rebel against everything. If you think about it, the idea of just rebelling against everything just for rebellion's sake is its own form of conformity, is it not? But just questioning things and just trying to see if they're right for you, right? Just because it's right for somebody else doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you, or it may be right for you. Either way, it's just good to ask the questions. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. Let me share something I teased at the top of the show. Then I'll leave you with a quote and one more little surprise for you here at the end. First, this idea of the joy in the potential. I mentioned that in the top. I was going to share something about the joy in the potential. One of the big themes of this interview was life-changing trips. And any trip, any moment in a day, any person, any encounter with nature or person you encounter, an interaction you have, any quiet time for yourself that you spend with yourself. I can go on and on. Any of these things has the potential to change your life for the better in that moment, for the better for the day, for the better for the rest of your life, or completely change your life trajectory. I have been shocked so many times to hear how one conversation led somebody, halfway across the world on a trip or in some complete other direction. And the only way we can allow those things to guide us is by just being present and connecting, right? Another big theme of the show, connection. So I will tell you that when it comes to daily life, that lingering possibility of the potential of anything at any moment changing my life for the better or forever, that excites me. That really excites me. So if you're looking for something fun to do as you go about the rest of your day, remember the joy in the potential of moments to transform. So take some time with yourself today. Remember the joy and the potential and see what happens. All right, I'll leave you with a quote from William Faulkner, who said, "Always dream and shoot higher than you know you can do. Do not bother just to be better than your contemporaries or predecessors. Try to be better than yourself." There you go. Now a little surprise to close it out. Not your normal Zero to Travel theme music. I'm going to share one of Tony's tracks from his band Dear Boys. This song is called Yes Men. I hope you enjoy it. Let's rock out of here. I'll see you next week. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
So long ago, those people I asked question and they said they disapprove. Explanations, reasons, yes, I'm sure I understood them. Personal beliefs, the freedom of their chosen land. But when the money man held out his hand, they changed their feelings. The question got a new response. It was different once. They got their orders. Here come the yes men, turning which way is right just as long as they stay the yes men. But tell me which way is right when it's wrong. Hey. I guessed it just might happen. He who pays the piper calls the tune, or so they say. When honesty and conviction are